On the first Friday of December, 1963, the Dellard Register landed on doorsteps across the valley the way it did every week, folded in thirds, slightly damp from the morning cold. By Saturday, most of the 1,400 people who lived in that Ohio valley had read the front page at least twice, and the thing that half of them had half-sensed for years, some shadow at the edge of things, some unanswered question in the way two brothers looked past each other at the grain elevator, finally had a name. The name had been sitting in the public record for 25 years. Nobody had known to look for it. Before we get deeper into this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of my upcoming videos. Because this story, it is one you are going to want to sit with for a while. Let me take you back. To understand what happened in Dellard, you have to go back to the land itself, because in this part of Ohio, in those years, the land was everything. It was the measure of a man's past, the security of his future, and the one thing a father could leave his sons that the world could not easily take away. The Calder farm sat on a long ridge above the valley, where the hardwood forest thinned into open ground, and the fields ran south toward a creek that divided the property clean in two. On a clear morning, you could stand at the limestone outcropping on the ridge and see both halves of it below. 240 acres of Ohio hill country that a man named Ezra Calder had spent his life working into something worth inheriting. Ezra died in the spring of 1928, 3 months before his elder son's wedding and nearly a year before the markets collapsed. He left the land equally to his 2 boys, with a note in his own handwriting that the county recorder would later call the most straightforward document he had processed in 20 years. It said, "Keep it together if you can. Keep it in the family if you can't." The elder son was Robert, 27 years old that year, tall, square through the jaw, with the kind of deliberate face that made people assume he had thought carefully before he spoke. He usually had. The younger was Franklin, 23, lighter in coloring, with gray eyes set deep in a lean face and a way of leaning on a fence post that made you want to stand there alongside him a while. People liked Franklin without trying to. He never asked them to. Robert married a woman named Dorothea Hess from the neighboring township in the late summer of 1928. Dark-haired, practical, steady as fence-post oak. She came into the Calder household without ceremony and without illusion, with full understanding of what the work was going to ask of her. Franklin stayed on his portion of the land and built a small house in the lower meadow near the creek. He was young and unhurried, and there was a girl in town, Louise Pratt, whose father ran the dry goods store on the courthouse square, who had a particular way of looking at him on Saturday mornings that made the errand take longer than it needed to. Every spring, the brothers walked the fence line together, starting at the creek and working north through the oaks, tacking wire, resetting posts, checking each section for winter damage. By noon they reached the limestone outcropping on the ridge, where they ate cold biscuits and looked out over both portions of their father's land without saying much. It was the kind of silence between men who have known each other since before words were necessary. There would come a day when that silence would mean something else entirely. What came next did not arrive all at once. The crash of 1929 did not hit Ohio Hill farmers like a storm. It hit them the way cold water rises in a low field, slowly and from the ground up, until one morning you looked down and realized you were already standing in it. By 1931, corn was selling at prices that barely covered the cost of hauling it to the elevator. Robert and Dorothea had a son that year, a boy they named Ezra after the grandfather. And the weight of the child, the weight of the land, and the weight of the falling prices all arrived in the same season. Franklin married Louise Pratt at the First Methodist Church on a Saturday morning in April of that same year. A small ceremony, the pews half full, the light coming through the east windows at a low spring angle. Their first winter together was cold and lean, but Louise kept meticulous accounts, and they came through it with the bills paid and a small amount set aside, which was more than most. Robert was not so careful. This is the thing that only became fully visible later, in the kind of accounting that follows human disasters when enough time has passed, and the facts can finally be laid out without anyone flinching away from them. In 1929, before the markets had announced themselves, Robert had borrowed $1,100 from the Dellard Savings and Loan to purchase a second tractor and expand his planting. It was a reasonable decision for a man in his position at that time. The problem was that grain prices did not recover, and by 1933 the note was past due, and the interest had grown it larger than it started. He did not tell Franklin. He told himself he would handle it, that he would find a way, that Franklin didn't need to know. The 3 lies a frightened man tells himself in a specific order, each one making the next easier to believe. There was an evening in November of 1933 that those who later pieced this story together came to think of as the hinge, the moment the door was standing open, and a different choice was still possible. Robert walked down the creek path to Franklin's house after supper in a cold and clear night that smelled of wood smoke and frozen ground. Franklin was on the porch, splitting kindling, and through the kitchen window Louise sat at the table with the household ledger open, the lamp burning close beside her. The 2 brothers sat on the porch steps, and Robert had come intending to speak. He had rehearsed something on the walk down, some version of the truth, some version of asking for help. But sitting there, looking at the lamplight through the glass, he found he could not make himself say the words out loud. Instead, he talked about the weather. He talked about the price of corn. He stayed 30 minutes, and then he walked back up the creek path with nothing said and everything unchanged. Some decisions are made in a moment of action. Others are made in a moment of inaction, and those are the ones that tend to last. Winter came down hard. Robert sold 2 hogs in January and a piece of equipment he'd been meaning to keep, and scraped together enough to quiet the bank for another month. By March of 1934 he was behind again. He sat across the desk from Gerald Fitch, the manager of the Dellard Savings and Loan, a precise man who understood that sentiment and money occupied different rooms, and that keeping the door between them closed was the condition of doing his job honestly, and heard the situation laid out plainly. The note was coming due. The bank needed payment or collateral. Robert looked at the desk between them for a long time. Then he told Fitch that his brother owned the adjoining property, 120 acres, free of any lien, the deed held clear since their father's estate was settled. He said his brother had authorized him to use it as collateral. This was not true. The transaction was completed the way most county business was completed in Dellard in 1934. Quietly, on paper, through offices that trusted the names of families they had known for a generation. Robert signed where Fitch indicated. The note was extended and the files were closed. Franklin knew nothing. He was, in those same weeks, buying seed at a price that gave him real confidence about the coming season, and he and Louise were expecting their first child by summer, and he had spent the previous fall adding a bedroom and a proper kitchen to the small house by the creek, working the lumber himself from trees he'd cut off the back of his own acreage. His was a life being assembled piece by piece, the way a man builds something he means to last. Franklin and Louise's daughter arrived in July. They named her Margaret, and Franklin walked into town the next morning with a look on his face that made the men at the feed store shake his hand, and the women behind the dry goods counter-say things that made him color. Robert made his note payments through 1934, and told himself, more than once, that he was going to fix what he'd done, that once the note was paid down, he'd find a way to quietly reverse the deed, and Franklin would never need to know there had been anything to reverse. He believed this. The believing was easier than he would have liked to admit. In April, The brothers walked the fence line together as they always did. They reached the limestone outcropping at noon, ate cold biscuits, and looked out over both portions of the land below. Robert's fields to the north, Franklin's to the south, the creek a silver line through the lower meadow. Neither of them spoke of what was in the files at the Dellard Savings and Loan. The view was the same it had always been. They walked back down, but a transaction on paper has its own kind of life, independent of intentions, independent of regret. And by the end of 1934, Robert had fallen behind again. A tractor repair in September cost more than he'd budgeted. He paid what he could through the winter and made promises he wasn't certain he could keep, and in the spring of 1935, Fitch called him in once more. This time, the document on the desk was different. It was not an extension. It was a transfer of title, Franklin's 120 acres, held in trust by the bank against the full outstanding balance, now grown to $1,420, with fees and accrued interest. Robert sat in front of it for a long time. Then he picked up the pen and signed where Fitch indicated. Franklin Calder's land, cleared and fenced and tended for 7 years, the land his father had given him, the land his daughter had been born beside, now belonged, in all practical terms, to the Dellard Savings and Loan. Signed over by a man who had no legal authority to sign it. The spring of 1935 arrived in Dellard with the ordinary indifference of Ohio Aprils. The redbuds came out along the creek, the fields were turned, and Franklin planted his corn in the first week of May, working his rows in the deliberate way he had learned from his father, the soil turning up dark and fragrant behind the plow. He did not know that the ground beneath his feet had been signed away. He would not know for 2 more years. Robert carried the knowledge the way a man carries a stone he has agreed never to put down. It showed in small ways: a hesitation before he spoke in certain company, a habit of standing at the kitchen window after supper and looking out at nothing until Dorothea called him back. Their son, Ezra, who was 5 that year, would remember in later life that his father stood at that window a great deal. He remembered it the way children remember the texture of a feeling before they have words for it, something in the air of the house, present and shapeless, that never quite went away. Robert paid the note down through 1935 and into 1936, working the land harder than he ever had. There were months when he genuinely believed he would pay it off entirely and find a way to reverse the deed before anyone looked closely at it. He had not worked out the mechanics of this, but he told himself it was possible because it was easier to tell himself that than to walk down to the creek path and say the words that needed to be said. Franklin, in those same years, was doing well in the unassuming way that careful men do well. His yields were modest but consistent, and he purchased a second-hand truck in 1936, dark green, a cracked side mirror he never replaced, and Louise expanded the egg and preserves operation, selling from a stand at the Saturday market on the courthouse square. Their daughter Margaret grew into a dark-eyed, serious girl who liked books. Evenings, she sat at the kitchen table reading while Louise sewed, and Franklin listened to the radio. The 3 of them in the lamplight, the fields dark and quiet outside. Franklin would sit there and think, not quite in words, but in the way contentment presents itself, that this was what his father had meant when he wrote that note about keeping things in the family. He had no idea how close he had come to losing it. The trouble arrived in the form of a letter, as trouble so often does. It came in the autumn of 1937, addressed in the formal typeface of the Dellard Savings and Loan, a notice of a delinquent tax assessment on his property, filed against the land as held in trust by the bank, with a request that the holder of record come in to discuss unpaid taxes for the year 1936. Franklin read it once, then twice. Then a 3rd time, standing at the kitchen counter with the morning still cold around him. He drove to the bank that same afternoon. Gerald Fitch was in his office. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, and by the end of it, Franklin was sitting very still in the chair across from Fitch's desk, holding a copy of the trust document that bore his brother's name alongside a transcription of his own. He drove home without stopping in town. He sat in the truck in the yard for a while before he went inside. Louise looked at him from the kitchen doorway and knew, the way wives know, that something had broken. Franklin walked up the creek path to his brother's house that evening. It was October. The oaks had turned and the leaves were down on the path, soft and dark, deadening his footsteps. And he passed the place where the path crossed the roots of the old sycamore, and the bend where the creek came close to the bank, and the stone wall his father had built the year before Robert was born. He had walked this path 1,000 times since childhood. He had the bank document folded in his coat pocket. Robert was in the barn when Franklin arrived, moving a piece of harness from one hook to another, the way a man keeps his hands occupied when he is waiting for something he cannot stop from coming. He heard Franklin's footstep in the doorway. He did not turn right away. What passed between those two men in that barn is not fully recoverable. Most reckonings between brothers aren't. What is known, from Franklin's own account given years later and from things Robert told his wife in the months that followed, is that it was not a loud conversation. There was no shouting. There was not even the kind of anger that announces itself and then passes. What there was instead was something quieter and, in some ways, worse. A long silence after the facts were laid out, in which Robert did not deny what he had done and did not offer an explanation that amounted to anything. Franklin stood in the half-dark of the barn and looked at his brother with an expression that those who knew him would recognize immediately. It was the expression of a man who has decided something permanently. He walked home the same path he had come. He did not speak to his brother again for 11 years. Think about what that means. Not 11 weeks, not 11 months, 11 years of fence lines and feed stores and county fairs in a town of 1,400 people where you cannot go anywhere without seeing the person you have decided not to see. Franklin Calder chose that, and he kept the choice. The legal matter took most of 1938 to resolve. Franklin hired a lawyer from Chillicothe named Howard Albright, who had handled farm disputes throughout the region for 20 years, and when Albright reviewed the documents, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment before he spoke. He told Franklin the transaction had been executed fraudulently, that Robert had no legal authority to pledge Franklin's deed, but that unwinding it was complicated by the subsequent title transfer and 2 years of accumulated tax arrearages. The bank had no interest in being seen as complicit in fraud, but it was unwilling to simply return the title without resolution of the outstanding balance. The balance was Robert's debt. The land held against it was Franklin's. That was the trap. And it had been set without Franklin's knowledge, without his consent, and without any mechanism for him to have stopped it. Albright filed a quiet title action in the Dellard County Court of Common Pleas in the spring of 1938, naming Robert Calder as a defendant alongside the bank and listing the fraudulent pledge as the central fact of the dispute. Once filed, it became a matter of public record, available at the courthouse to anyone who took the trouble to look. Most people in Dellard didn't take that trouble in 1938. They had enough of their own difficulties, but the county recorder noticed, and the courthouse clerk noticed, and the editor of the Register read the filing summary and made a small note to himself that he never followed up on. The awareness existed, in early form, in the fabric of the town. It just hadn't been given a name yet. The case resolved in December of 1938. Robert agreed to sign over his own property, his 120 acres, the north half of what Ezra had left his sons, to the bank in satisfaction of the debt. Franklin's title was restored, clean and unencumbered, the back taxes paid from the settlement. Robert Calder, in 4 years, had lost everything his father had given him. He and Dorothea and their son packed what they could carry from the farmhouse on the ridge and moved to a rented house on the south end of Dellard's main street, a small white clapboard place with a low porch and a yard that backed up to the alley behind the hardware store. It was a respectable house. It was not a farm. Robert found work at the grain elevator, keeping the loading records. He was careful with numbers, and the manager was glad to have him. He wore the same overalls he had worn on the farm, walked to work in the mornings past the courthouse square, and the men he passed greeted him as they always had. Nobody said anything directly about what had happened. Not yet. Not for a long time. Franklin and Louise stayed on the farm. The land was theirs again, clear, free, exactly as it had been, and Franklin went back to working it with the same deliberate patience he had always brought to it. But something had changed. Not in the land, not in the work, in the man. He was quieter than before, in ways that Louise noticed and Margaret noticed, and the men at the feed store noticed, without any of them having the full story to understand why. He did not speak ill of Robert. As far as anyone could determine, he did not speak of Robert at all. When people asked, carefully, the way people ask about things they already half know, Franklin would look at them a moment, then look away, and say that he and his brother had had a disagreement about land, that it had been settled in court, and that was all there was to say about it. It was not all there was to say. But in a town like Dellard, a man's deliberate silence is its own kind of answer, and the town accepted it as one. The early 40s brought the war, and the war brought its own sorting of men and circumstances. Franklin was 36 when the country entered the fight in December of 1941, old enough to be exempt from the earliest drafts, with a farm the County Agricultural Board designated as essential production. And he planted more acres and worked longer seasons and sold grain at prices that, for the first time in his adult life, let him feel something close to prosperous. Louise expanded the produce operation and started a stand at the end of the farm lane, and Margaret, 12 years old by then, helped on Saturday mornings, learning her mother's way with the small notebook and the envelope for taxes set aside before anything else was touched. It was a good life. It was the life the land had always been capable of providing once a person stopped trying to outrun it. Robert's son, Ezra, enlisted in 1943 at 17 and shipped out to the Pacific in the spring of 1944. Robert and Dorothea stood on the platform at the Dellard Depot on a gray March morning, surrounded by other families doing the same thing in their own particular ways, some loudly, some quietly, some with the specific rigidity of people who have decided not to fall apart in public. Robert shook his son's hand. Dorothea held on longer than she intended to, and then let go. Franklin was across the square that morning, having come to town for feed. He stood at the edge of the small crowd on the depot platform and watched his brother stand very still as the caboose disappeared around the bend, and he watched Dorothea take Robert's arm, and he watched them walk back toward the main street together, growing smaller in the distance. He stood there a moment after they were gone. Then he walked to the feed store and finished his errand and drove home. Ezra came back from the Pacific in 1946, changed the way young men come back from that theater of the war, quieter in some rooms and louder in others, needing time to find the rhythm of ordinary life again. He worked the grain elevator alongside his father for a season, then hired on with a construction company out of Columbus, building the new housing going up east of the city. He married a girl from Lancaster in 1948 and moved there. He came back for holidays and wrote to his parents on the first Sunday of every month, which was a habit his mother had asked him to keep and which he kept faithfully. He did not know the full story of what had happened between his father and his uncle. He knew something had happened, and he had learned over the years that there are things you don't ask a man like his father about directly. Margaret Calder finished high school in 1949 at the top of her class and enrolled at Ohio State University, the first Calder to attend a university. Franklin drove her to Columbus in September in the farm truck, and on the way home he stopped at a roadside diner outside Circleville and sat for a long time over a cup of coffee, looking at the parking lot, not reading the menu. He thought about his father's note. "Keep it in the family if you can." He thought about everything that phrase had and had not been able to protect, and then he paid for the coffee and drove home through the dark. The 1950s arrived in Dellard with the particular quality of that decade in small Ohio towns, a surface prosperity covering a deeper stillness. The sense of a world changed just enough to feel different, but not enough to feel new. The main street got a hardware store with a plate glass window. The grain elevator was expanded. A new school went up on the east edge of town. Robert aged into his 50s with the quiet dignity of a man who has accepted a diminished life and is making what he can of what remains. His hair went white at the temples. He was reliable at the elevator, even-tempered, thorough. And he joined the Methodist Men's Club and helped with the volunteer fire department and sat on the Farm Bureau Advisory Board, participating in the life of the town in the steady way of a man who no longer takes up more space than he is given. Dorothea became known as one of the finest pie bakers in the township, winning the county fair 3 years running. In a town like Dellard, that kind of reputation carries a warmth in it that means something beyond the pie. People weren't forgiving anything directly because nothing had been said directly. But there is a way that a community wraps itself around a family that is doing its best, and Dorothea felt it. Franklin's farm flourished in the modest way that good hill country land flourishes under careful hands. He replaced the equipment piece by piece, repaired the farmhouse roof in 1953, and was regarded in Dellard as a decent man who kept to himself more than was strictly necessary, understood as a preference, not a failing. Nobody pressed him on it. The brothers saw each other the way men in a small town inevitably do, at the elevator, at the hardware store, on the courthouse square during the county fair. They did not speak. They gave each other the minimal nod that is technically a recognition and practically nothing at all. The town saw this and drew its own conclusions, none of which were entirely accurate, because none of them had the full picture. In 1952, Dellard acquired a new county assessor named Chester Polk, who had come from the regional planning office in Columbus and brought with him a systematic approach to property records that the county had not previously experienced. He spent his first year conducting a thorough audit, correcting inconsistencies, working through the historical files that had accumulated in comfortable disorder for decades, drawer by drawer, box by box. It was Polk who first read the complete file on the 1938 quiet title action. He read it carefully, without hurry, going back to the beginning when he reached the end to make sure he had understood it correctly, noting the fraudulent pledge, noting the defendant names, noting the resolution. He filed it and went on to the next box. But he remembered it. Chester Polk had the kind of memory that holds the things that don't fit the ordinary pattern. Louise Calder died in October of 1958, a stroke, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She had been hanging laundry on the line behind the farmhouse, and Margaret found her there after school, lying in the long grass beside the laundry basket, the sheets still moving above her in the October wind. She was 52 years old. Franklin received the news with the stillness that had become his way with hard things. He did not cry at the service or at the graveside in the Methodist churchyard on the hill north of town. He cried in the barn, alone, which had always been his place for it. Half the town came to Louise's service. Robert and Dorothea sat in the back. They did not speak to Franklin. He did not speak to them. There are forms of respect that look, from the outside, like indifference, and there are forms of pain that look from the outside like composure. That afternoon contained both. The early 60s brought a different kind of change to Dellard, the slow, unspectacular change of a small town beginning to feel the pull of a larger economy. Young people left for Columbus and Cleveland, the dry goods store closed in 1961, and the railroad stopped its service to the valley altogether in 1963. Dorothea Calder died in the spring of that same year. The cancer had been present for some time before it was found, and she died in the small white house on Main Street that she and Robert had moved into in 1939 and had always thought of as temporary, even after living there for 22 years. Robert sat with her at the end. He was alone in the house after. Ezra drove from Lancaster when he could. Robert kept the house clean, kept the yard tidy, walked to work in the mornings, and sat in the kitchen at night with the radio on. That was the shape of his days now, and he filled them the way a careful man fills the time he has left. Chester Polk had been county assessor for 11 years. In those years he had quietly assembled a full picture of the Calder situation, reading the court filings, obtaining the original bank documents, driving to Chillicothe to sit with Howard Albright, who was still practicing in reduced capacity from an office above a hardware store, and who remembered the quiet title action with complete precision. Polk had established the facts. What he had not decided was what to do with them. He sat with this question through the winter of 1962 and into the spring of 1963. He was not a man who believed that old wrongs automatically demanded public accounting, but he was also not a man who believed that silence served the record when the record bore on a living man's standing in his community. He talked to his wife about it one Sunday evening, not using names, framing it as a general question of ethics. She said that in her experience things kept in the dark tend to find their way out regardless, and the only question is whether they come out in a way that serves anyone's interest. Polk thought about this for several days. Then he drove to Chillicothe to see Howard Albright. They sat together for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon in April, the documents spread between them on the desk. Albright said that from a strictly legal standpoint, the matter had been resolved in 1938. Franklin had his land, Robert had lost his, the bank had been made whole, and there was nothing more the law could or should do. Polk said he understood that. Albright said that what Polk seemed to be asking about was not a legal question. Polk said that was correct. Albright sat for a moment, looking at the documents. Then he said that in his experience, the men who suffered most from situations like this were not always the ones who had been wronged. They were the ones who had done the wrong, and then had to live in the same town with it. Chester Polk went to see Robert Calder on a Thursday evening in May, walking to the White House on the south end of Main Street in the long, late spring light. He knocked. Robert answered and looked at Polk with the expression of a man who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for a specific knock on a specific door. He held it open. They sat at the kitchen table. Polk laid the folder between them without theater and explained what he knew and how he had come to know it. Robert looked at the documents but did not pick them up. He sat with his hands flat on the table. He said he had wanted to fix it. He said he had believed in 1934 that he would pay the note off and reverse the deed before anyone was hurt, that he had not understood at the time that you cannot borrow against another man's land without that man's knowledge, and that by the time he understood it, the events were already past him. He said he had thought about going to Franklin more times than he could count, had gotten as far as the creek path more than once, and each time had turned back, telling himself that what Franklin didn't know couldn't be made worse by a confession. Then he paused, and he said he didn't actually believe that had been the real reason. He said he thought he had told himself that because it was easier than the alternative. The kitchen was quiet around them. The evening light came orange through the window. Somewhere down the alley, a screen door opened and closed in the warm air. A man, sitting with the truth he has carried for 30 years, looks different from a man sitting with a lie. There is a particular exhaustion in the honesty, like something that has been held up for a very long time finally being set down. Polk drove out to Franklin's farm on a Saturday morning in late May. Franklin was in the equipment shed working on the tractor with the patient attention of a man who has repaired the same machine enough times to know exactly what it needs. And he came out wiping his hands on a rag and looked at Polk with a mild, assessing patience. They sat on the bench outside the barn. Polk told him what he had found in the records, what he had confirmed through Albright, what Robert had said in the kitchen 3 weeks prior. Franklin listened without speaking and looked at the folder on the bench but did not open it. When Polk finished, Franklin sat for a while watching the upper field, where the corn was coming up in clean rows in the morning light. He said he had known most of it. The quiet title action had given him a fairly complete picture of what had been done. The thing he had never known, and had always wondered about, was whether Robert had intended to fix it, or whether he had simply assumed the transaction would go undetected. Polk told him what Robert had said. Franklin considered this. Then he said that a man believing something sincerely doesn't make it any less of a betrayal. Polk said he agreed with that. Franklin said he had made his peace with it, or as much peace as a person can make with something that doesn't fully allow for peace. He said he didn't want anything from his brother. He had the land, he had worked it had provided for his family, and that was the whole of what land was for. Polk asked if Franklin thought the town should know. Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then he said that wasn't a decision that was his to make. The truth came out in Dellard, the way most truths come out in small towns, not all at once, and not through any single announcement, but through the gradual accumulation of knowing in a community's shared awareness, the way a creek rises after a long rain. Slowly from many small sources until it is simply there. Chester Polk filed an amended property history with the County Records Office in June of 1963, restoring the full documentation of the 1934 and 1935 transactions to the file for both Calder parcels. It was, technically, a routine administrative act. It was not reported in the register, but it was there, in the files, for anyone who looked. Gerald Fitch, retired in his late 70s, living with his daughter in Newark, wrote a letter to the Dellard Register in the fall of 1963, ostensibly about the importance of careful record-keeping in county banking. It contained an oblique but unmistakable reference to a case from the mid-30s, a property transaction conducted without the true owner's consent, and the consequences that had followed both parties for many years. The editor of the Register read it 3 times. Then he read it again. His name was Hal Drury, and he had grown up in Dellard and had known both Calder brothers the way you know men you have lived alongside most of your life. Which is to say, he knew their surfaces well and their interiors not at all. He sat on the story for 3 weeks. He drove to Chester Polk's office and spent an afternoon there. He drove to Chillicothe and sat with Howard Albright and his files. And on a Wednesday evening in November, he knocked on the door of the small white house on the south end of Main Street. Robert let him in. They sat at the kitchen table. Robert told him what had happened in 1934, and what had happened afterward, and what had not happened in all the years between, and he did not ask Drury to protect anyone. He said he had spent 30 years with this knowledge, and if the town was going to know the truth, he would rather it know the truth as he told it than as it filtered through other people's versions. Hal Drury printed the story on the front page of the Dellard Register on the first Friday of December, 1963. He called it simply A Matter of Record. It laid out the facts of the 1934 transaction, the 1938 quiet title action, and the resolution, with the names named plainly, the documents cited accurately, and Robert Calder quoted directly on his acknowledgment of what he had done and his statement that he had wanted to fix it and had not. It did not quote Franklin Calder. Franklin had declined, through Margaret, to comment. The town read it. At the diner over eggs and coffee on Saturday morning, at the hardware store and the feed depot and the Methodist Fellowship Hall, at kitchen tables and on front porches, in the quiet, weighing way that people in small towns process things that involve people they know. What they said was not, for the most part, cruel. This is worth noting. A town's judgment, when it has had time to sit with a thing and turn it over, is often more measured than the individuals who comprise it might be alone. The people of Dellard knew Robert Calder as a reliable man who had been their neighbor for 30 years. They knew Franklin Calder as a quiet man who had kept his own counsel on a matter that had cost him considerably. What they had been given was not the story of a villain and a victim. It was the story of a frightened man who had made a ruinous decision in a ruinous time and had lived inside the consequences of it ever since. It was a recognizable human story, the kind that people who have lived long enough can find something of themselves in, even when they would not have made the same choices. Robert Calder walked to work the Monday after the paper ran, down the south end of Main Street, around the courthouse square, past the hardware store and the empty space where the dry goods store used to be, along the north side of the square to the grain elevator. The same path he had walked for 24 years, the early December cold, his coat buttoned, his breath visible in the air before him. Several people he passed said good morning. He said good morning back. At the elevator, he went to his desk, opened the ledgers, and began his day's work. The town did not shun him. The town did not make a ceremony of forgiving him. What the town did was what small towns do when they have absorbed something true about one of their own. They adjusted their understanding of him, quietly, without announcement, and went on. Spring of 1968. Franklin Calder was 63 years old. He came into town on a Saturday afternoon in April for feed and found himself walking down the south end of Main Street and found himself standing on the sidewalk in front of the small white house with the low porch, and he had not planned to be there. He stood for a moment. Then he went up the walk and knocked on the door. Robert answered. He looked at his brother across the threshold. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Robert held the door open. They sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Polk had sat, where Drury had sat, where Robert had laid his hands flat on the table and told the truth to the men who had come to hear it. They drank coffee and talked for 2 hours. They talked about their father, about their children and grandchildren, about the farm and the creek and the way the valley looked in April with the redbuds out. They did not speak directly about 1934. They did not need to. Everything that needed to be said about it had been said in one form or another through the long record of 2 men living out the separate consequences of one decision. What was left in that kitchen in the spring of 1968 was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness implies a clean resolution, and there is rarely a clean resolution to the things that matter most between people who have known each other since before they could speak. What was left was something quieter and more durable than forgiveness. It was the acknowledgment between 2 old men who were not going to live forever that they were brothers, that they had both survived, and that the land, their father's land, the land that had been the center of everything, was still there on the ridge above the town, still turning under the plow each spring, still producing what it had always produced. Franklin finished his coffee and set the cup down and stood up and said he had to get back for the evening chores. Robert walked him to the door. They shook hands on the porch. Franklin went down the walk. At the sidewalk he turned briefly, just once, and looked back. Then he walked toward the square and his truck in the long April light, past the courthouse, past the Methodist church, past the hardware store and all the buildings that marked the shape of the life he had built in this valley over 60 years. Robert stood on the porch and watched him go. Franklin Calder died in June of 1971 in the farmhouse on the ridge. He died in the morning in the bedroom where he and Louise had slept for 30 years, with the window open and the sound of the creek just audible if you were quiet enough to hear it. He was 66 years old. The service filled the First Methodist Church past capacity, with people standing along the walls and out onto the steps. Chester Polk was there. Howard Albright sent a letter, read at the service by Margaret, that spoke of Franklin's steadiness and his patience in the face of things that would have made a lesser man bitter. Hal Drury wrote the obituary, and it was the best piece of writing he had done in 30 years of editing the paper. Robert Calder sat in the back. He was the last one to leave the church. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the empty pews and the light coming through the windows, and then he went out into the June morning. He died himself in 1976 in the White House on the south end of Main Street, with Ezra beside him. He was 75 years old. His obituary noted his years at the grain elevator, his service to the community, and the names of his survivors, and noted briefly that he had spent the first years of his adult life farming the ridge above Dellard before circumstances had required a change of direction. It did not say more than that. It did not need to. That part of the story was already in the record where Chester Polk had put it. Margaret Shear, Margaret Calder as she had been born, taught 4th grade at the Dellard School for 31 years, and when she retired in 1984, the school gymnasium was named for her. She was surprised by this and pleased in the way that people are pleased when something they worked at for a long time is simply, finally, acknowledged. Franklin's grandson, named Ezra after the great-grandfather, took over the farm on the ridge when his parents grew too old to manage it, and worked it through the 80s and into the 90s, expanding carefully, adding what was prudent and holding back what was not. He repaired the fence line each spring. He knew the land's inclinations the way his grandfather had, where it drained slowly after a heavy rain, where the soil went thin near the limestone outcropping, where the corn grew tallest in a dry summer because the roots reached Old Creek bottom. You learn a piece of land like that only one way. You stay with it. In the spring of 1995, a young woman named Sarah Polk, Chester Polk's granddaughter, studying Ohio history at Ohio State, spent 2 weeks at the Dellard County Courthouse reading property files for her thesis on Depression-era land records. She found the Calder file. She read it in full. The original documents, the trust filing, the quiet title action, the amended property history her grandfather had filed in 1963, his notes in the margins. Careful and precise as everything he had ever written. She drove out to the farm on the ridge. Ezra Shear answered the door. He made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had been Louise's in the house Franklin had built on the land Ezra Calder had given his sons. And he talked for 3 hours. He told her about his grandfather's stillness, his way of walking the fence line each April without saying much, the lamp burning at the kitchen table, the second-hand green truck with the cracked mirror, the Saturday market on the courthouse square. He told her about the creek path and the oaks and the limestone outcropping, and about the barn in October of 1937, and about everything that had and had not been said inside it. He told her because he knew the story from his mother, and because he believed the record deserved to be complete, about the winter of 1934, and what his great-uncle had done, and why, and what it had cost. He said his mother had always believed the story was really about a question underneath all the rest of it. What does a man owe his own family when he is frightened? And is fear ever a sufficient reason to take from one person to save another, even when that other person is himself? Sarah Polk wrote it all down. Her thesis was filed in the Ohio State Library and cited by a handful of subsequent historians, and it was read by the editor of the Dellard Register, a woman named Carol Drury, Hal's daughter, who had taken over the paper when her father retired in 1981. She read it in 1996 and wrote a long column about it for the Friday edition, the same Friday edition in which her father had printed the original story 33 years before. She noticed that, sitting at his old desk, in the same office, with the same view of the courthouse square, she thought the record, assembled piece by piece over 60 years, by her father and Chester Polk and Howard Albright and Franklin Calder's silence and Robert Calder's eventual candor, and finally a young woman at a courthouse table with a yellow legal pad, had the quality of something that had always been moving toward completion. She filed the column and drove home through the valley on a clear October evening, past the grain elevator, past the courthouse square, past the Methodist church, and took the road that wound up toward the ridge. The fields were cut and brown for autumn. The ridge was dark against the sky. The land was still there. It had outlasted all of it. The fear and the fraud, the silence and the reckoning, the men and women who had worked it and been shaped by it and handed it down. It sat in the valley the way land sits, without judgment, without memory, without anything that could be called intention. The judgment and the memory and the intention had always belonged to the people, and the people, in their slow and imperfect and very human way, had done what people in small towns eventually do with the truths that live among them. They had let them be known,